Hello, and this is Guy Clapperton welcoming you back to the middle of the fourth season of the Near Futurist, halfway through already. Now, I've been writing about technology since 1989. You asked my daughter, I was all in black and white then. Actually, I do remember a news editor disbelieving me when I said a contact had seen a prototype of a laptop with a colour screen. Change has since then been called digitalisation, change management, all sorts of things. My guest today has a few things to say about that, but first, a quick plug for my media training service at Clapperton Media Training. Or your clients want to sound as confident, clear, and fluent in media interviews as the people in this podcast? Of course you do. My team and I can help. Drop my assistant Lindsay, that's lindsay@clapperton.co.uk, a note, and she'll set us a time for an initial chat. Or go to the website at clapperton.co.uk, two P's, to find out more. Now, back to the podcast. Okay, step away from a kettle, we're back. Alongside all this change and evolution I was talking about in the intro, inevitably we have a bunch of people working to make it real and ensure their skills are up to scratch. If you're listening to this weeks or months after we recorded it, then as I speak, China's DeepSeek is making waves as a big noise in artificial intelligence, wiping a lot of the share price off Nvidia and making the whole industry change as a result. This means, of course, reskilling. Meta, Facebook's owner, has reportedly mobilized a war room of engineers to respond. My guest knows a bit about bringing people up to speed. He's co-founder and chief academy officer at 1010, a tech academy that proposes to deliver candidates for jobs to companies with the right skills when they need them. He can explain it better than I can, of course. His name is Ash Gawthorp. Ash, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Guy. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're more than welcome. Now, Ash, if a business the size of Meta is having to deploy an entire war room, that's a phrase I picked up from somewhere and I don't necessarily endorse it, of developers, then how can the less resourced world hope to keep up?
I think the whole DeepSeek announcement is really making big waves. It's really caught the big US tech companies napping, frankly. I guess if we look at it from Zuckerberg's point of view, prior to him waking up that morning with the announcement, they were on the front foot and in a pretty good place. They were ahead of the field, sort of swimming in a lovely blue, uncongested ocean. I think they were in that scale phase where the models that they and the others had developed were becoming incrementally better through training on larger and larger data sets with an ever increasing number of parameters. And everybody was happy. The infrastructure people were happy as they need vast amounts of compute to train and run this on, vast amounts of power to train it. So, one stat I saw, ChatGPT-4 used over 1,000 gigawatt hours of electricity to train. So that's enough to power 100,000 US homes for 1 year. And coincidentally, that's 10,000 times more power than Marty McFly's DeLorean needed to travel back in time. So I guess everybody, the VCs, the PE houses, the investors, they were delighted because they see a pathway of revenue through scalability, scaling that existing tech, and the fact that no one else has the ability to access those levels of infrastructure on that scale. And I guess finally we have a Trump government in place who have said they are massively backing tech and AI to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. So they're sitting out in front with no clear competition. Then all of a sudden, out of blue, comes this organization without access to all the infrastructure or access to NVIDIA's latest silicon at scale, and comes up with something that smashes the sort of Silicon Valley tech masters' entire world view overnight. So here's a model that's truly disruptive, that doesn't use anywhere near the same kind of power, doesn't use the latest silicon, and is far more effective. So I guess at this point, what Zuckerberg sat there doing, he's really got no choice but to throw a lot more engineers at it in the war rooms, as he terms them. But, what we've seen from history is that throwing more engineers at a problem is often not a good pattern for delivering something early when it comes to timescales. And they're definitely in a tight spot now. I think as well, to some extent, in the less sort of resource tech world, where we don't have thousands of engineers sitting around that we can redeploy, and ultimately, organizations that aren't building these models like Meta, like OpenAI, like Google, but are rather consuming them. I think to some extent, everybody's sort of sitting back with their popcorn and sort of watching this unfold, really. And I think they're doing that safe in the knowledge to some extent that the way these models are traditionally consumed by organizations and by individuals, you're plugging these kind of foundation models, if you like, into cloud frameworks from the likes of AWS's Bedrock, where you're able to pick and choose really which one the winner is and which one's the most cost-effective model in order to be able to use for your own workloads. So to some extent, I think this will all work in their favor.
Nonetheless, people will need to be trained. There are new skills required for the people who are going to be working on the infrastructure, if not the people who are just pointing their browsers in different directions. Now, training people's all very well, but how do you avoid people's skills dating? I mean, if you send me a delegate who's really hot in 2025 and delivers everything, then there could be another sea change like is happening at the moment. How do we prevent them getting rusty by 2027?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think actually you've hit on one of the big challenges that a lot of our customers are seeing at the moment. Many roles that exist at the moment, particularly those in fields like DevOps, for example, where an engineer can expect to use many, many different tools. When a company's trying to hire someone into those roles, they'll speak with the team leads and say, what tools, what platform, what tech are you actually using? And they'll reply with a list of 10, 15, sometimes more than 20 sort of skills and tools that they're using on a day-to-day basis. And then the recruitment team has to turn this into a job ad and put that out there and into the market, asking people who have these skills. And then obviously often the exclamation you then get back is, oh, we can't find people with exactly this skills match. And actually that's often not entirely true. It's sometimes more of a case of we can't find people with exactly a skills match at a price point that we're willing to pay. And we kind of call that person a purple squirrel, really. They're very rare. You're not going to find them. And you need to step outside of that. Your recruitment team needs to understand that somebody with experience in tool X is actually very similar to tool Y that they're asking for. And sometimes there's a lot of overlap with tool Z. So their experience is very relevant, but it's much more nuanced. And that's hard enough trying to find somebody today with the skill sets we have in 2025. If you then think, oh, what's that person going to look like in 2, 3, 5 years' time? And how rusty are they going to be? And how up to date are their skills going to be? I guess there's a couple of things here. So on the one hand, I recall some of the skills that I learned sort of 30 years ago that are still used today, for example. But at the same time, some things change very, very quickly. They will change and they will evolve over the next 2 years. But in my experience, the industry always takes a evolution and not revolution approach. So new things often build on existing things. They're very similar to the way that the previous sort of generation of tools works. And it's very rare that something is entirely new and starts from scratch. The most important thing to addressing this for me is recognition that the skill set that somebody has is really just a snapshot, a point in time. This is the skills that they have now, and the recognition that in a couple of years that will have changed, probably quite likely beyond all belief. So there'll be very little overlap with what they have now. The most important thing is that the person that you find has an aptitude and an attitude and a will to continue to learn and keep learning. And that is absolutely key. Ideally, if you're the manager of that team, then what you hope is that the person that you're hiring will be coming to you saying, we're using this tool at the moment. This is coming up on the horizon. I think this will be good. I think this would work well for us. This is the research I've done on it. This is maybe how we could adapt it. And having people who will and who want to learn and develop their skills and evolve, not just for the role you hire them into now, but for what the role will be in numerous years' time.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm sensing that a lot of training is reactive. The scenario you just described is when the employee comes to you and says, you as the employer, and says, this needs to change. On a very simplistic level, way away from all this programming stuff. For my media training sessions a while ago, I thought my PowerPoint was looking a bit pedestrian. So I did an online course, I read the accompanying book, and I revamped it completely. But that means I'm still only as good as the intersection of my skills and ability to learn and that course's content, which is now going to be dated because it's not constantly updated. The guy who put it in place is going to retire at some point. And the book is obviously a physical book. You cannot physically update that. What I'm getting to in a rather long-winded way is how can companies and individuals build a sort of strategy to avoid their skills dating?
I think on the one hand, we're in a very different place to where IT upskilling was 20 years ago. But on the other hand, and to the point I made earlier, I bet you that training that you did on PowerPoint is whilst the versions of PowerPoint will have evolved tremendously, 90% of what you learn is still just as relevant with the 365 version of it in the cloud today as it was with the very, very earliest versions of PowerPoint. So again, a lot of that is still relevant. So yeah, essentially you need to build a strategy of understanding what products are out there and whether this is materials that you've built yourself or whether this is materials that exist on the internet, whether it's paid for, whether it's free. And actually nowadays there is so much cheap or free quality material available online. The biggest challenge is that there's so much of it and a huge amount of it is actually rubbish. So what you need is somebody with expertise who knows what it is that the individual is trying to achieve through this learning and to be able to guide you through the process of identifying what training courses and materials are good and signposting you at those, but also, more importantly, that are applicable in the real world and most importantly, are pitched at the right level for that individual based on their current level of experience and expertise. When you understand that and can build a picture of that, you then need to build learning pathways aligned to developing skills and crucially define the learning outcomes aligned to what they need to do in order to be able to do this role. So it's very clear and transparent. If you want to be able to do X, then you need to follow learning pathway Y. And that will sort of walk you through it. It is quite a lot of work up front, but once that is in place, and once it is well signposted, and that's crucial. We often see that being overlooked where all this great stuff is built internally, but individuals in the organization don't know where to find it or where or what it is. But once you have that in place, you can use it over and over again and really sort of get the return on investment that you put in it. One other thing that's essential that needs to happen is that not just that you're building these learning pathways, but that you are reviewing them periodically and ensuring that they're still fit for purpose, that they're still up to date, and then replacing them and kind of end of lifing these things when other products become more suitable or other things become more available. But I think we're in a very different place to where we were in IT upskilling, 20, 30 years ago, where if you wanted to upskill and certify crucially in a vendor's specific product, you'd need to attend their very expensive face-to-face classroom-based training, where after you'd handed over or your company had thousands and thousands of pounds, you were pretty much guaranteed to get the certification. And this was almost like a right to practice, like you might get with law or accounting or medicine, where the role advertised mandated that you were accredited in the qualification from the likes of Cisco or Oracle or whoever else it was. Nowadays, that's really changed. And even the large organizations are making their training materials available for free externally because they recognize that ecosystem of individuals who are trained in their products, who will then go on to work in organizations using their products. And that ultimately drives licensing sales, which is really what they're focused on.
You mentioned the old classroom style of learning. Of course, I'm of a vintage where I went on courses to supplement my work when I was younger. But most of my real learning, if I'm honest, was in making mistakes and starting again on the job. Is that still how people learn even in the technology field?
Yes, 100% in my view. And in fact, there's no better learning than through that mechanism. It is possible to train for a certification by studying the content, revising it, and running practice exams, much like you might do with traditional approaches to studying for GCSEs or A levels. But if you have the certificate on the wall, that does not mean you can actually apply it and do the job. There's almost kind of a two-way street here, essentially. If you are doing the job and you're using it on the job, then you can sit the exam tomorrow and you will probably pass it. You might get some of the more obscure stuff that isn't used very often wrong, but generally you will get by. And by applying what you've learned in real world scenarios, encountering problems, then doing your own research, making your own mistakes, crucially, and working around how you fix them. That's how you learn. Coincidentally, there seems to be a lot of research around how the length of time you leave between applying the knowledge you've learned and the length of time knowledge is retained for shows that applying knowledge with larger gaps rather than cramming it all in at once for an exam means that you retain that knowledge much, much longer. And a crucial part of that learning process for me is not just following the happy path, not just following contrived examples where they're all engineered to work perfectly. It's about actually you making mistakes, you trying things, trying different approaches, those approaches failing, you then having to research errors, understand those in more detail, maybe do a bit more reading around the subject, and then go back in again. The resiliency that builds and the confidence that builds with that approach and the way that knowledge then retains in your memory is for me is absolutely second to none. In fact, one example there, one practical example, so on our tech academy, we had an individual, I won't mention her name because she was mortified at the time, but essentially we were working with AWS, sort of building infrastructure in the cloud, and part of this, you need to configure the software with your credentials, with your username and your password to be able to start all this infrastructure up. So it makes sure that you are who you say you are and that, frankly, they know where to send the bill. And in this case, she'd done a great job of building this application, of deploying it, but she checked into GitHub, which is what we use for source code management, those credentials in there, the username and password. So effectively, they were accessible by other people who could then use those credentials to be able to spin up infrastructure themselves or for all kinds of other nefarious purposes. This was captured quickly. GitHub themselves sort of scanned for this stuff. They recognized it, and our administrators received a comment saying, or received a message saying, this individual has done this. Please remove this. This is bad practice, and you can't do this. And it was fixed. And in actual reality, the accounts were created especially for this purpose. They were very limited in what they could do, so the scope of it was very, very limited. But herself especially, and in fact everybody else in that cohort, got to experience firsthand what happened when you do something which is a mistake. And if she was just taught this as a bullet point on a PowerPoint slide in terms of make sure you don't do this, she may well forget it. But pretty sure now that for the rest of her life, she will remember that and she will not make that mistake again. But she made it in an environment where it was safe and where there was no risk of anything bad happening as a result.
That's one thing. Are there enough corporates out there, do you think, who actually tolerate mistakes because they have human beings operating these things?
Well, certainly speaking for the customers that we work with, pretty much all of them in some capacity or other recognize this and implement it, that when people are training, they need to fail and they need to learn through this. The most important thing, however, is that they're allowed to fail and that they have the right support and the right oversight, and that what they are failing on is done in a safe way where the risk is non-existent. So we work with organizations in secure environments on sensitive data, or for example in cyber roles for organizations supporting critical national infrastructure. Now that is not the place to deploy somebody with no experience. That would just be foolhardy. So whilst failing is necessary and it's very, very important, the most critical thing is a context of where you do it and you make sure that you're doing it safely.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. We're going to pause there because that's the end of part one. But in the next episode, we'll dive a little bit deeper into the corporate culture you need to keep those AI skills dynamic. And I'm also well aware we haven't asked you what 1010 actually does, so I will give you that opportunity in part two. But for the moment, Ash Gawthorp of 1010, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Guy. It's a pleasure to be here.
And thanks very much for listening, all of you listeners. So thanks for that. The next episode will be along in 7 days' time.